I'm Sandra. Welcome to the video. Welcome to my life. I'm a super active young adult. I love exploring outside and I spend a lot of my time in the health and fitness world. And I have been shying away from the cold this week, which means that I didn't get to do any fun outdoor activities, and instead I stayed inside and did some schoolwork. I've been sitting in a chair all weekend, so I figured it was time for me to stretch. And while I do that, I figured I might as well talk to you about whether or not stretching is good for you. Basically, inconclusive. Who knows if it's good for you or not. But I wanted to talk through some of the research and some of the conclusions that have been made about stretching, just help clear things up, because health science is really hard to do, and it's really hard to get conclusive answers from health data just because it's very difficult to control for all of the variables. It takes forever for researchers to come to conclusions about health. If you think about stretching, for example, and you're thinking about if it's good for you, or one of the ways that it could be good for you is if it prevents injuries. You might look at me, I am not flexible, but knock on wood, I'm not very injury prone. Whereas someone who is super flexible might get a lot of injuries. What variables can you control for? In a study comparing the two of us, their flexibility might not be the reason they're injury prone. We could compete in different sports at different levels, run with different shoes. Maybe they didn't eat enough calcium growing up and they get stress fractures. That's not at all related to flexibility. Yeah, it's really hard to control for variables in health studies, which is why it's really hard to find conclusive data. But let's talk through it while I stretch. So before we really talk about anything, it's really important to understand the different types of stretching. I will break down the two most common. Most people, when they're thinking about this, are going to be thinking about static stretching or dynamic stretching. Static stretching is this. Don't do that. Static is stretching while still. Dynamic stretching is going to be working through range of motion or stretching while moving, thus the names. And they both have actually different effects on the body. But if we look at dynamic stretching, because there's a little bit more evidence that leads to the answer of is it good for you. Dynamic stretching before a bout of exercise does improve exercise performance. It increases power production, it increases flexibility, and it increases range of motion. So power production is your ability to produce strength over time, or not over time, in a short period of time. That's going to be your logical definition. Power is work in a certain amount of time, I believe, physics wise, and work is the relationship between force and distance. Yeah, that makes sense. Force over a distance. So if you think of like pushing a box, work is going to be how much force was put into pushing that box a certain amount of distance, and power is going to be what did you need to start, what if you look at like instances or shorter periods even of time, not distance. So a really common power measuring tool in athletes is going to be a vertical jump test. Now obviously a vertical jump isn't going to be relevant to every kind of athlete, but a lot of athletes will have higher power production in a vertical jump, even if vertical jumping isn't relevant to their sport, just because the muscle used and the power production used is similar to a lot of other movements. And so there was a test that looked at dynamic stretching before vertical jump, and it found that there was an increased power production in athletes that did warm up or did dynamic stretch before. And there's tons of other data that this specific study supported. So dynamic stretching is positively related to improved sport performance, but there's a ton of controversy on if this helps with injury prevention, and that's because of the reasons that I've already said. That it's really hard to do science on people, right? I'll say that 50 times in this video. That's dynamic stretching. Now if we look at static stretching, which is what I'm doing right now, the data basically says that static stretching decreases muscle tone, it decreases the activity of your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight nervous system. And it increases vasodilation, which leads to better circulation. These are all acute effects of static stretching, so you're not going to see like decreased muscle tone for the rest of your life. So I am static stretching because I'm constantly stressed. And that's why a lot of people feel really good after yoga, because you're decreasing that muscle tone and decreasing the activity of your sympathetic nervous system. Static stretching is going to be what affects your connective tissues a little more, so the fascia and the ligaments and the tendons. You'll get the effect there, and that leads to increased range of motion in this case, whereas dynamic stretching is more increasing heat, which increases the flexibility of all of your tissues, which increases range of motion. So those have different effects on range of motion. One thing with static stretching is that it has been proven to decrease exercise performance when performed before. So if you're going on a run and you're stretching your hamstrings with like a touching your toes situation and like doing a bunch of static stretches before your exercise performance, don't do that anymore. Because it's been shown in multiple studies that it decreases exercise performance. So switch your pre-exercise routine to dynamic stretches and those more warm-up type activities, and leave static stretching to whenever you feel like it. There is an extent to which you don't want to overstretch your connective tissue. I don't actually know any of the research on that, so I won't get into it. That's some effects that are pretty solidly proven of static stretching. Again, there is no link to decreased risk of injury. The ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine, has guidelines and recommendations. They kind of have this all or nothing approach. They say that they found the highest rates of injury in those who only stretch some days, and that the rates of injury in those who stretched some days were higher than those who stretched no days and those who stretched every day. And I find that a little bit interesting, because what I think when I hear that is like people that stretch 0 days a week are likely active maybe 1, maybe 2 days a week, or 0 days a week, right? Like they're not participating in regular physical activity, whereas those who stretch every day are participating in regular physical activity, and those who stretch some days are likely participating in physical activity. So if you think about, of course there's going to be no injuries in people who are not participating in physical activity and therefore are not stretching. So really can only compare the someday stretch and everyday stretch. And okay, it is interesting that there were injuries in those who stretch someday, but is that because they're newer to physical activity, and are the injuries related to maybe lack of knowledge of how to use equipment, or overuse because they're going from running 0 miles a week to running 20 miles a week and they're not following by that 10% rule? And that's not really related to stretching, or is it because of stretching? Again, too many variables. But those are ACSM guidelines of like 20 minutes a day, and you should stretch every day, and that's when you'll see the most benefits. So yeah, it's kind of your boat to ride on whether you think stretching is good for you or not. I would say that it's pretty safe to say that dynamic stretching before exercise is something we should all participate in because of the improved exercise performance, not because we know that it helps prevent injury. I like to static stretch because it makes me feel good. And I think that's good enough reason. If something makes you feel good that is not because it is addictive in releasing serotonin, then you should do it. That's my hot take. It is important, of course, to do your own research and look into everything. I'll have the articles that I looked at specifically for this video below. I did just pull a lot of things out of my brain because I have an education in health and exercise science, but if I did refer to an article or use an article for information, it'll be in the box underneath me. Obviously, when you're reading articles, make sure that you're checking them for bias and you're using peer-reviewed journal sources. That's where real science happens and is published. And like I said, you're going to find contradicting things. So if you find something and you're like, this is good science, search the opposite of it. See if there's any science backing up any of the other things. And that'll help you guide your own research, and obviously listen to health professionals, and you got it. Thank you so much for spending your time with me.